everyone, and happy independence. I'm Wendell Jones, and welcome to our program, Jones and Company. On this program, we examine the national issues of the Bahamas. The Bahamas is celebrating its 45th anniversary of independence, and all through this week, we have been endeavoring to talk about our country, the Bahamas, what it is, and where we have come from as a country. And on our program today, we have two of the framers of the Constitution of the Bahamas, as we call them. There were 15 men who went to London, England for the Constitutional Conference. And today we have 6 of them who are alive. And today we thought we would invite Mr. George A. Smith, who was then a cabinet minister in the government of the Bahamas in 1972, to be here today. Also here in the center is the former Governor General of the Bahamas, Sir Arthur Foulkes, who was a member of the opposition delegation in London, England back in December of 1972. We have come a long way as a country over the last 45 years, and today we are going to talk about our country, the Bahamas. Sir Arthur, welcome to the program. Thank you for being here today.
My great pleasure.
And Mr. Smith, thank you for being here today. Good to see you.
Thank you.
Sir Arthur, you know, back in 1972, the delegation was made up of men of the then Progressive Liberal Party and the Free National Movement. You attended, and of course, a whole lot have transpired in the country since then. Back then, what was the mood of the Bahamas in 1972?
I think there was a hopeful mood in the country. Well, between 72, between the conference and by the time independence took place, I think there was a hopeful feeling in the country. You know, we had some problems approaching independence and political problems, but I always like to say that one of the finest moments we had in London, we had some disagreements, but one of the finest moments was when the government and the opposition, in other words, the Bahamian side, opposed the British on a question of citizenship, because there were a lot of people, Mr. Smith might remember this, who came to the Bahamas from other countries when they became independent, like Jamaica, Australia, came here to register, went to Government House to register to preserve their British citizenship. And the British wanted us to take all of them as citizens. And we told them no, and they were insistent because they had a problem. I think it was some place in the Far East. They were coming up with this problem, so they wanted to use us as precedent, and we told them no.
So there was agreement between the government and the opposition on all of the issues?
No, not on all of the issues. There were some issues like extending full citizenship to women, for instance, or giving women the same rights to pass on their citizenship. That was an issue. Rustication was another issue. What else? There were about 4 issues that we disagreed on.
Those were the 2 principal.
Those were the two ones.
principal.
The rustification one was a very important one for the opposition.
Yes.
I believe that there were some people in the delegation who wanted to banish people to some parts of the Bahamas, eh?
Yeah. Well, the thinking at the time was, and the thinking was not without reason, you know. But, you know, we didn't think, the opposition at the time, we didn't think that we could do that in the Bahamas. The thinking was to stop what was happening in some other countries, like some African countries, where the people are educated at the expense of the government, and then they were recruited to go to England. You go to England, you see African doctors, and people need doctors in Africa. The same thing what Cuba is doing. Cuba's done that. Cuba will not allow their doctors to go to the States. Yeah. They send doctors to Africa and all the rest of that. And so we thought, we understood the argument, but we couldn't do that in the Bahamas. Yes. We couldn't, that was a stretch too far.
Mr. Smith, looking back at the times that we spent since the 10th of July 1973, there are a good number of Bahamians who have a difficulty with the citizenship provisions of the Constitution and believe that perhaps the then delegation made some mistakes. Do you agree?
Not really, because we had to deal with the situation based on what was known to us. So Arthur very properly pointed out that there were a lot of Bahamian women abroad who had married foreign men who had children. We didn't know. We didn't know where they were. We didn't know what kind of attitude they had towards the emergence of Bahamas as an independent country. So we took the safe way out. But we put in the Constitution the method by which the Constitution could be updated and corrected based on what information would come forward. For instance, when the British insisted that we take that category of people the South referred to earlier, we didn't know the numbers. We didn't know, in some cases, the country of their origin. We didn't know their attitude towards the Bahamas. So there were some unknowns that the British didn't share with us. So we found a way of saying to them, okay, what we will do, those who present themselves within a given period of time, 3 months, we will consider them. The others, that's the cutoff date. We didn't know how many Bahamian women really had moved from the Bahamas, married men from throughout the world, and how many children they would have and all that. So it was to have dealt with the issue. But I believe that the position for women, which was strongly held by Sir Arthur and I think Sir Kendall Isaacs, and I don't know the other, well, I don't know the position of the other members of the delegation. There were people also on the PLP side of the divide also had that view. But of course, there were so many unknowns. We have a lot, having gone through the experiences of the last 45 years, we have a lot of areas we should look at our Constitution. We should look at the state and determine that now is the time for us to become a republic where the head of the nation is a Bahamian. Because I think most informed Bahamians believe that there is no position should exist in the Commonwealth of the Bahamas in 2018 that cannot be held by a Bahamian. I think Bahamians have come a long way. We can hold our own in the academia world. We can hold our own in the professions of the world, most professions. So there shouldn't be any position in this country that is beyond the reach of Bahamian, and the head of state should also be that. We have to look at correcting the deficiencies in terms of the gender equality, in keeping with the fact that we have signed on to the United Nations various protocols to do with equality.
Yes.
We need to give stronger voice to the protection of young people, the protection of those who are disabled. We need also to make an input in our country to promote that unique quality that I think only exists in this country and nowhere else in the world, and that's Bahamian culture.
But it can be argued that the framers of the Constitution, the founding fathers, made it a little difficult to change the Constitution. We've had referenda in our country, and they've all failed. There are countries in the region, Barbados, for instance, you don't need a referendum to change matters of citizenship, for instance, in their constitution. But didn't you make it difficult to make these changes?
Well, you know, the referendum is a safety valve. It's important. I think the problem is, where we have fallen down is in educating our people about some of the intricacies of the Constitution, and also the way we have approached the referendums, I prefer the anglicized version, if you don't mind.
Yes.
The way we have approached the referendums was too political. And I am not sure that the referendum, the referendum on the equality of women, I'm not sure that was decided on that issue alone. I think people had some other things on their minds. And you know, referendums could be tricky, that's true. But they're there to make sure that no government could just change the important, what we call the entrenched provisions of the Constitution, just lightly do it. And you know, that's why it was, I defend the referendum. What we have to do is to educate our people. And like Mr. Smith mentioned, for instance, becoming a republic. If you put that to referendum now, there will be all sorts of problems.
Yes.
Because people do not understand. I was on the radio just the other day. Somebody was talking about that, and they got it all mixed up. To become a republic, all you need to do is to change the head of state from monarchy to republic, from governor general to president. That's all. But people conjure up all sorts of things, a Republican style of government. They think of America, they think of Latin America, and the Caribbean, let's see. India. Yes. India's a republic.
Yes.
Trinidad,
Singapore.
Dominica, and they have the same identical parliamentary system that we have.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it takes educating, you know, it takes educating our people and explaining to them. And I believe if both political parties do that together, and I've always advocated that, our constitutional changes ought to be together. And unfortunately, we have not been able to achieve that. There were a lot of political considerations in the referendums we have had.
And the system of government that we have a whole lot of people have difficulty understanding and appreciating that. Yeah. And while you're here, gentlemen, we talk about the Westminster system of government quite often on some of our shows. And there are some people who believe that that is not the best system for us. But we have employed that for all of these years.
But you know, we say, excuse me, we say Westminster, eh?
Yes.
And it is true that we got our system directly from the British. And the British Parliament sits at a palace called Westminster, hence the appellation Westminster.
Yes.
But the truth of the matter is, it is a parliamentary democracy. And this is the form of government that is chosen by most of the democratic countries, nearly all of Europe, parliamentary democracy. And after World War II, the Americans didn't try to impose their system on Japan. Japan is a parliamentary democracy. Yes. The oldest parliamentary democracy in the world, there's some dispute about some small states like Marino, but the oldest functioning parliamentary democracy in the world, or the oldest parliament, is not Westminster, it's Iceland, the old thing in Iceland. Parliamentary government is all about a people being governed by their elected representatives. That's the basis of it. And when we say Westminster, we cloud, we got that from England. So,
but aren't there certain conventions that we adhere to, or we ought to adhere to?
Yeah. Which other peoples around the world also do. And that is because, not because the British were great geniuses, the British learned, or the English, learned over a period of centuries that if you did that, then you're going to run into trouble. And it took them a long, long time to arrive at these conventions, and they work. For instance, the idea of collective cabinet responsibility. It's important to have that, and it's important to have the kind of discipline that assures collective responsibility in cabinet government. Otherwise, you would have chaos.
Chaos. But there are some people who want a free-for-all.
Well, yeah. You know what disturbs me about those people who wish to say they have a problem with the Westminster system? In many cases, they have not made an effort to educate themselves about it, how it really works, how it has worked in many, many countries of the world, Europe, Africa, Far East, the Caribbean, and they talk about changing the Westminster, and usually it is people who personally had some difficulty. They think that the discipline that is necessary when applied shouldn't apply in this case. But none of them tell you what they want to change it for, and I've often been baffled by the fact that people want to change something but have no idea what they want to change it to.
Place, yeah.
Well, a necessity of a change is to replace it with what?
Some better, hopefully.
Something better.
Yeah.
Now, I think that there are ways, Belize, for instance, critique their system a bit where they, in their governmental structure, has permitted the engagements following elections to bring in private entities for the life of that government to assist them in seeing that the partisan program that has to be implemented by the government is carried out. Well, fine, that's possible. There are other ways of doing it, restructuring to fit the demands of the time of the public service. Now, we ought to do that, but it doesn't mean you abandon that which has worked thus far successfully for nothing.
Not only that, there are things that they do at Westminster that we do not do here.
Yes.
For instance, there is a committee on every item in the budget and in the cabinet. There's a committee on education. There's a committee on defense. And these are parliamentary committees, and they help to hold ministers to account. The reason we cannot do that here is because our parliament, this is one of the difficulties of having too small. And so effectively, in England, you have 21 cabinet ministers. That's all you know. You got dozens of junior ministers. The Ministry of Defense alone may have 4 or 5 junior ministers, yeah. But 21 cabinet ministers. But then you have a backbench of 200, 300 people.
Yes.
And the backbench help to keep the ministers in line, and they have committees, as I mentioned, that meet and they talk to me. We can't do that here. We don't have the numbers to do that.
We just have 39 total.
And nearly all of the government members are ministers.
Ministers.
That's one of the penalties you have to pay for being small.
Yeah. Over the last 45 years, we have seen administrations change. They come and go, and we've been changing them in great regularity over the last 15, 20 years. Let's speak to our quality of governance that we have had over the last 45 years. Sir Arthur?
I think we have done, we could do a lot better. We could do a lot, and I go back again to what Mr. Smith was saying. A lot depends on education and understanding. Mr. Smith would know that he was a younger part of a movement we had in the PLP called the NCPA. And we were preparing for government. And what we did was we read, Mr. Jones, we read all we could read on the system. We read Jennings on cabinet government. We even read about diplomacy. We read political novels. We educated ourselves. We read political philosophy. I'm afraid that a lot of people who offer for public life these days don't take the time to educate themselves about the system that they propose to operate. And that causes huge problems. And I think that is where and I say that with regard to both political parties. Right?
Yes.
But I see recently, I see where the PLP is having a sort of seminar?
A module for aspiring candidates.
Yes, I think that's a brilliant idea.
You know what also has happened, Wendell, in the last 20-something years? Somehow or the other, prior to that, there were members of the House who were there for periods of time. The Bahamian people decided they're going to hold on to that MP because they want him in there. We have had turnovers recently, as you said. We haven't had a government that was returned to office. The last government that was returned to office was in 1997.
Yes.
That's the last time a government was voted back into office. It must mean that both sides and the other splinter parties have not so satisfied the people that they want to return that party back to government after one term. And in some cases, it ends up with the senior member of parliament being somebody who has been in there for 2, possibly 3 terms.
Yeah.
So the continuity isn't there, the experience isn't there. And when these new members get elected, they become so puffed up and so full of a sense of importance, they wouldn't know how to go to senior former members of the House to say, well, would you talk to me about what is expected of me?
Yes, but this has caused a deterioration in the
tremendous
quality
deterioration.
of governance in the country,
And
because
hence-
you don't have that continuity.
Absolutely, and hence, the constituents are left to believe that this is the very best when they really expect so much more and have a right to expect so much more than they're receiving in terms of these new members who professes to understand, and in some cases they never read the Constitution. They hardly read the platform on which they get elected. I'm amazed that sometimes that after both the major parties publish their platform, it'd be interesting to find out how many of the candidates for those parties actually read the platform before election.
But aren't the people, though, overall responsible for the quality of governance? Because the people ought to educate themselves, and they should know what to expect from politicians. People ought to understand what democracy is all about, understand our system.
It's a two-way street, though. Hey, I mean, it's a chicken and egg thing. The representatives have a responsibility to educate the public. The public needs to be educated so they can make sound judgment about who they want to represent them. But it is also the responsibility of those who govern to educate the public as well.
Yes.
So, and we have, I agree with Mr. Smith generally, we haven't been as good as that as we ought to have been. We need to educate. You know, if you have an ailment, you go to a qualified doctor. If you need something done technical, you go to somebody who's qualified. Politics is not exactly like that, but you need some of that. You need qualified. One young man said to me one time, he says, you know something? I want to elect somebody who is smarter than me. I thought there was a lot of wisdom in it. What he was saying was, I want to elect somebody who's qualified to represent me. When you get in trouble and you're looking for a lawyer, you go to a lawyer, you get somebody. There's a dynamic between the representative and the represented, between the constituency, because, and again, this is also misunderstood. The MP is not just there, I have to word this very carefully, just to do, quote, what the people want me to do. The people elect him to govern in their best interest because he convinced them that he and his party could better do that, could represent them. And it is up to him to explain to his constituents as we go. That's a part of the MP's job. Because, if you take for instance, if you took a referendum, for instance, tomorrow and say, do you want free education? Everybody would say yes. University level, they would say yes. Do a referendum the next day. They say, now we're going to pay for this by this tax. They would say no.
No.
So your representative has to make judgments and explain to you, this is in your interest and this is the way we have to do this.
Yes.
And, that's what you have to do.
I was flying on a plane.
There's a dynamic there.
I was flying on a plane, coming from an island when we were talking about introduction of VAT. I forgot what the agreed figure was. I think it was the 7.5 that we eventually settled on. And I asked the man if he had explained it to his constituents yet. He said, well, he can't do that. He's hoping that the then Minister of State for Finance would come to his constituency to explain it. I said, well, you haven't explained it to your constituency? He said, no, sir, because I don't understand it. I said, well, how are you going to represent people on an important step that's being taken and you don't understand it?
Have we abused the Parliament and the system that we have? And I'm talking about those who operate it. For instance, we have a Senate, Sir Arthur, where we see neophytes who are appointed.
Well, we don't have
to,
debate in the House of
Senate.
Assembly anymore.
Yes.
We have people reading speeches.
Yes.
The Senate, one of my pet peeves, and both political parties have done this over the years. The Senate, the whole idea behind the Senate is to have a body, and that's why we call it the upper house, to have a body where sits senior politicians, people who have had political experience, or other citizens, mature citizens from other walks of life, who can make but not as a reward for having lost the election, not as a training ground
for candidates.
That's not the idea. That's not, and both political parties have done that over the years. And so we've devalued that, what could be an important arm of our system, the Senate. Because if you have senior people who are no longer running for office, for instance, or people drawn from maybe the arts community, from other senior people in the community, who could speak freely and frankly, without any, repercussions, and say to the government, whatever government of the day it is, you better take another look at this.
Yes.
But we haven't done that. We have trainees,
In the Senate.
people who lose for the first time, and they go to the Senate.
If you were to go,
If you lose an election, you are rewarded by
if you
a
were to
seat in
go
the
to the
Senate.
United Kingdom and you go to the House of Commons, the elected body, and you see a reflection of the United Kingdom society, young, middle-aged, women, old, people of the various cultural diverse background. And then you go to the House of Lords, sitting up there are men and women who's got 60 years of experience under their belt. When they say something to you, it's based on tremendous knowledge and wide experience. We have people in our Senate, and have had for many years, are people who, first of all, don't understand the difference between the Senate and the House. They just think this is the place I'm going to go and hold on, and hopefully next election I win one seat.
And so we have a weak House and a weak Senate as a result of people who do not have the experience.
Generally.
I, as a reporter, covered Parliament when Sir Arthur was a member of the House of Assembly.
Well, it's
along
another point
yes?
Mr. Smith made, too, and let us not overlook that, too. The members of Parliament are supposed to know their brief. As a matter of fact, you couldn't get up in the House and you could read the budget communication, you could read special communications and stuff, but you could not read your speech in a debate. You can make notes to remind you of the points you want to make, but you have to make those points on your feet.
Yes.
Nobody does that, and that's the point.
They read everything.
Yeah. Well, we've been talking about politics on this first portion of our program today. Sir Arthur, when you demitted office, you made a speech, and I think you mentioned the costening of our society. And when we return, we want to talk about how we have grown and developed socially in our country over the last 45 years. We take this break here, and we'll come right back.